Strange Happenings in the Wood by Gyant Chart. Many people who hear this story may find what I'm about to tell them hard to believe. Call it fact, call it fiction, call it an overreaction to normal stimuli. Once again, this is an extraordinary series of events, but I figured this might make for an exciting story to share with the listeners of this podcast. This story is a short collection of strange happenings that my dad experienced while in the forest. Things that he and I cannot explain. We have no absolute idea as to what happened. If anyone has any theories, I'd like to know. Incident number 1. The Scream. To start, let's discuss the first strange occurrence my dad had. This one happened to him in the 70s when he was a kid living in Astoria, Oregon. Now, to people reading this, you're probably wondering what Astoria is like. Well, have you ever seen The Goonies or Kindergarten Cop? That town where the movie's filmed in? Thick Oregon forest bordering the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean, surrounding the city everywhere. That's basically Astoria. My dad grew up in that town for years and had one strange occurrence happen to him with his friend, which I'll call Eddie. Eddie and my dad were hooligans, constantly getting up to shenanigans, trying to do things like ride the empty boxcars on trains, only to find that the trains were speeding up, and by the time it slows down, they have an 8-mile walk ahead of them. They were partners in crime and were best friends because of it. One particular night, my dad and Eddie decided to go camping in a patch of forest near Astoria, not too far from the town, but still a decent distance away from civilization. They didn't have many camping supplies: old blankets, a pack of hot dogs, a thermos full of Kool-Aid, and a lighter. That's about it. However, Eddie decided to bring his Manx cat, Gremlin, to keep them company. So my dad and Eddie walked into the forest to set up camp. They built a fire, and soon they laughed at each other, telling stories and generally having conversation that 70s kids would have. It had been getting late and the darkness began to descend upon them. According to my dad, nights in Oregon differ from your usual nights. The thick pines and forest vegetation, it all adds a thick black wall of nothingness surrounding you in all directions. The only light they had that night was the glow of the fire. While my dad and Eddie were conversing, Gremlin was acting weird. Gremlin was motionless, staring directly off in one of the directions, his ears focused on something beyond the group's line of sight. All the while, my dad and Eddie heard footsteps around them, from the soft crunching of leaves and that general feeling humans have when they're being watched. These were all dead giveaways that the three were not alone. Suddenly, there was screaming off in the trees. The kind of scream my dad has never heard before and never wants to hear again. The type of scream that no known animal makes in Astoria. The kind of scream that immediately triggers your fight or flight response. The sort of scream that, according to my dad, reverberated through his body like a gong. At that moment, Gremlin jumped into the darkness and began running. My dad and Eddie were freaked out and immediately decided to get out. And so my dad and Eddie started to run through the dark, thick forest and searching for any sign of civilization, searching for a way out. Eventually, my dad and Eddie returned to Eddie's house where the police and Eddie's parents were standing outside. Soon, the grown-ups began questioning my dad and Eddie, asking what all the racket was. As it turned out, many people had heard the screaming and reported the incident to the police. My dad and Eddie honestly had no idea how to explain this to the officers, and they told them that it wasn't them making the noise. At first, the grown-ups stood there in disbelief. After all, it's that old horror movie cliche. Some ghost or monster appears to a group of kids and the adults don't believe the kids. And at first, it seemed like my dad and Eddie were in some trouble until everyone started hearing the screams again, coming from the forest. Those same dreadful screams. At that moment, grown-ups realized that my dad and Eddie were telling the truth. My dad and Eddie never had an experience like that again in Astoria. They just continued living their lives as they usually did after that incident, becoming teenagers, attending parties, graduating, and then going to college. They never found Gremlin. Whatever happened to him will always be a mystery to my dad and Eddie. Maybe Gremlin got lost in the woods and became a feral cat. Perhaps someone found Gremlin and adopted him. Or maybe, just maybe, something got him. Either way, Gremlin was never seen again. Incident 2. The Hooting. Years later, my dad and grandpa decided to leave Astoria and move to Wisconsin. How do I describe Wisconsin? Well, geographically it's boring. Aside from the Great Lakes, it's just flat land for what feels like miles, and Maybe you'll see some farmland and the occasional patch of deciduous forest. The reason for this is the glaciation that occurred during the last ice age, which smoothed out the state of Wisconsin like a hot iron. However, one patch of territory managed to avoid this fate. An area filled with rugged hills and thick forest, a region that the locals call the Driftless due to being free of any sign of glacial drift. My grandparents owned a plot of land in this area, mostly forest, but he used it with the occasional field of land for growing crops and herding cattle. My dad sometimes visited this area and encountered two more strange situations he didn't quite understand. One night, while my dad was on my grandparents' porch, my grandparents' house sits on the side of the hill bordering an even taller hill filled with oak and birch trees. He began hearing some strange hooting in the forest atop the higher hills next to the house. It almost sounded similar to coyotes, except it was slightly off. According to my dad, it didn't quite sound like coyotes. As mentioned before, my dad grew up near forested areas and told me he knew what coyotes sounded like. He told me these were no coyotes. It sounded like something impersonating them, and judging by multiple cries, there were numerous of them. My dad decided to play along. He began imitating the sounds, only to hear the moans grow louder and angrier. Whatever made those sounds was suddenly pissed off at my dad, and it wanted to clarify that he was not welcome there. My dad chuckled softly and decided, okay, I had my fill for tonight, and went back inside. And so my dad began sleeping in the guest bedroom. He was sleeping peacefully late that night when suddenly he heard a loud bang emanating from the house. Now my dad tells me that this was a huge thump that he heard that woke him up immediately. Like something took a massive club and smacked the walls of the house from the outside. Now my dad was freaked out. What had made that sound? Was it related to the hooting? At first my dad thought the bang would be the result from a ghost, but nowadays he's not so sure. Fast forward to hunting season out in the Driftless. The trees have barely any leaves left. The tall grass is starting to turn brown and curl down. My cousin and uncle were hunting in the woods that year and managed to shoot 3 deer in a clearing not too far from my grandparents' house. My dad saw the 3 deer and thought they managed to catch a good catch, so they decided to return to the barn and grab a tractor and trailer to transport the newly killed deer. By the time they returned to the clearing, they had seen one of the deer had gone missing. So the 3 of them were like, what the hell? What happened to one of the deer? So after packing 2 deer into the trailer, my dad, cousin, and uncle began searching the nearby forest for the deer carcass. Eventually, they found the deer, a few hundred yards from where it originally was. But that's not the creepy part. The weird part is that whatever found this deer had the strength to drag it and rip off one of its legs and clean out the socket. They didn't chew it off. They didn't claw it off. Whatever this thing was just grabbed the leg and tore it clean off. For this one, I've looked up what it could be. I'd imagine a coyote or a wolf not being that strong. My mind immediately thought of a black bear or maybe some sort of other bear that could potentially live in the area. However, according to the DNR, black bears are very rare in the region my grandparents' farm is in, which is Richland County. So, while it's not plausible, it is possible. I think it's unlikely that it was a black bear though. Plus, if it was a black bear, why didn't the bear grab its fill from the carcass and then leave when the humans approached like it normally would? Like, why would it drag it off, rip off an arm, and then dip out, you know? Even if you want to argue that the bear smelled the people nearby and decided to take the corpse somewhere else, why did it just take the leg when the people came and found it? I just don't get it. Then again, there were no signs of bite marks, claw marks, or anything else, so it makes me wonder what could have actually have done this. So that leaves me with a quandary about all of these events. I don't know what could explain these events, and my dad still holds on to the fact that he doesn't know how to describe them. So it's a fun mystery and a good story to tell around the campfire. Missing from the Cabin by Sonora. One 4th of July weekend in 2011, a buddy of mine, who we'll refer to as Todd, ended up in a precarious situation. What follows is the story as he told it to me. It was supposed to be a fun weekend up into the hills and into the woods. Todd and his friend Troy had a joint cabin they owned. Troy was to introduce Todd to a girl he also invited over. So naturally, Todd was looking forward to some devious fun for themselves downstairs for some alone time. Unfortunately, shortly after Todd and his date disappeared downstairs, Troy decided to go out for a little while. A while later, as Todd and his date were, getting into it, Troy returned to his cabin with some company. Upon hearing foreign voices upstairs, Todd went upstairs to see who was there. To Todd's dismay, he found that Troy had brought someone who he disliked, a guy named Ace. For the sake of this story, seeing Ace, Todd got angry and an argument ensued between Todd and Troy while poor Ace stood there awkwardly near the doorway. Cue Troy's girlfriend entered, only to stand next to Ace with a bewildered expression on her face. Todd had initially rushed upstairs in his boxers thinking that it was just guys that had arrived, so he and Troy quickly went downstairs to argue further. As Todd and Troy's argument diminished, Troy decided that he, his girlfriend, and Ace would go night swimming at a nearby creek for a little while just to cool off. For whatever reason, Troy threw on Todd's shorts to swim in, which had Todd's keys, wallet, and smoke in the pockets. Unfortunately, Troy and his company had already been gone for a few minutes before Todd realized what had happened. So Todd and his date continued downstairs until Troy, Ace, and Troy's girlfriend returned to the cabin. As Todd heard them returning, he went upstairs to confront Troy, fuming. Todd demanded his shorts back while yelling about his stuff in the pockets during Troy's swim. As the two argued back and forth, Troy's girlfriend, Todd's date, and Ace tried to blend in with the wallpaper. Todd demanded that Troy give him his shorts back right then and there. Troy informed him that he would not be stripping down in front of everyone. That was when Ace cut in to have Troy's back, making the argument even worse, unfortunately. But Ace knew Todd had quite a reputation for fighting and not losing, so he jumped into the argument to prove himself to Troy. Finally, after a bit of arguing, Troy and his girlfriend left in Todd's shorts again. Ace stayed behind, though for some reason, maybe because Troy had gone out with his backpack full of personal and essential items. Eventually, Todd and his date went back downstairs to go back at it. Of course, Ace stayed upstairs and kept company with Todd's pit bull. They all expected Troy and his girlfriend to return that night, at least for his backpack. But when everyone woke up the following day, they realized that Troy and his girlfriend had not returned to the cabin. Everyone was quite puzzled about that. They wondered what Troy was up to, but since Troy had left his cell phone in his backpack, they had all just hung out around the cabin and waited for him. The second night came with no word from Troy or his girlfriend. They really started to worry when they got up on the third day and there was still no sign of Troy. Alarm bells were going off for the trio. Todd decided to try calling Troy's girlfriend again like he had the previous day when her phone was switched off. That day it finally rang and she picked up. Fear crept in her voice when she realized that Troy was not back at the cabin like she assumed he would have been. So she and Todd agreed to call around and see if they could track Troy down. But no one had heard from Troy at all. Next, a panicking Todd called a few friends up the isolated... Next, a panicking Todd called a few friends up to the isolated cabin to help search the nearby woods for Troy. There was not a single trace of Troy. Todd decided to call Troy's girlfriend and have her report Troy missing, so she did just that, but when asked about Troy's last known whereabouts, she gave an honest answer. She told them that Troy was last seen at his cabin having a heated argument with Todd. The problem was that Todd had a well-known reputation for fighting and not generally losing. At this point in the following events, Troy had been missing for 3 days, so he was declared lost, but apparently they decided they should take it seriously. The following morning, Todd, his date, and Ace were fast asleep only to be startled to hear both the front door kicked in and people running in, all around the roof, everywhere. The SWAT teams had flooded in, subduing the trio inside. At one point, one of the SWAT officers said,
"I will shoot you and I will shoot that f***ing dog."
Upon hearing that, Ace suddenly popped his face up from the floor, exclaiming, "Why are you going to shoot the dog? Don't shoot the dog." Of course, the dog did not get hurt at all. What came next was the trio getting questioned by a couple of detectives portraying in the usual good cop, bad cop scenario like you see in the movies. Unfortunately for Todd, though, he was the last person seen with Troy and they were arguing. Couple that with Todd's reputation for fighting, making Todd the number one and only suspect in Troy's disappearance. It also didn't help that the detectives had found some clothing left by the hot tub and some of the dresses had drops of blood on them, though Todd insisted that he didn't even know whose clothes they were. Search and rescue came in next to comb the surrounding woods and for any clues as to where Troy's whereabouts could be. They searched for hours while Todd, Ace, and Todd's date were still being questioned heavily, but they focused mainly on Todd. After a couple of hours of interrogation, Todd finally got irritated and insisted that since Troy had been missing for 3 days, he could either be dead or alive. Still, they should be focusing their efforts on finding Troy. Oblivious to Todd and company was the fact that search and rescue had located Troy deep in the woods, an hour away from his cabin. Troy had passed out on a large rock, naked, just hours away from his demise. The next thing that Todd, his Dayton ace, and detectives heard was the sound of the search and rescue helicopter's chopper blades cutting through the air and getting closer to the cabin. As they peered at the door, they saw them approaching with Troy suspended in a blue diaper-like thing from it. The helicopter was looking for a safe place to lower Troy enough for the emergency ground personnel to reach him. As the smoke cleared, the whole situation became a bit more understandable a couple of days later. Todd was informed about the facts leading up to Troy's disappearance. Troy and his girlfriend left the cabin the night he vanished to cool off after the argument with a nice walk in the woods surrounding the house. But before they went for their walk, Troy's girlfriend stole his debit card. Shortly after setting out on their walk, Troy and his girlfriend got into an argument. They separated after that, and Troy's girlfriend ended up walking back to the main road, where she'd call for a ride, leaving Troy in the woods assuming he'd find its way back to the cabin. So basically, Troy's girlfriend turned her phone off for the next couple of days to avoid Troy's angry phone calls about his debit card while she partied the whole time. When she did finally turn her phone back on, she received Todd's concerned call about Troy. She was shocked to learn that Troy had been missing for the last few days. Troy ended up being relatively okay considering the circumstances. Todd moved out of state shortly after, which dissolved the friendship. As far as Ace, Todd's date, and Troy's girlfriend, well, they're in the wind. I'm almost positive, though, that none of the people involved in this story will ever be able to forget the events that took place over that fateful 3 days at the cabin. My Friend's Wendigo Story by Deadly Goddess 111. This story isn't mine but my good friend's, and I've never seen her this shaken while telling me a story before. She is the most genuine and open person I know, so I believed every word when she told me this story. I don't want to use her real name, so I will call her Jen. Jen and I like to talk about pretty much anything and everything when we reconnect. But one thing we love to talk about is spirits and the supernatural. I'm Native American, so stories about skinwalkers or similar mystical beings aren't alien to me. I even have my own stories. Jen likes to go to open fields on nights with full moons. We've done it together a few times, and it's like a uniquely surreal experience. But one night she went with a different friend that we will call Jessica. She and Jessica went to an open field and started walking through it. But this was different than other nights. Jen felt off. She thought she was hearing twigs snap behind her. She has bipolar disorder, so she thought it could just be in her head. But she was overwhelmed with this feeling that she couldn't explain. She just felt on edge and felt like she was being watched in every direction. They continued to walk, stopping in the middle of the field. Jen starts looking around, and if you have ever been in the middle of the woods with a full moon out, you know how it can just light up absolutely anything that isn't covered in trees. She saw something and she bolted, not saying a word. She left Jessica behind, but Jessica was quick to react and followed behind. They got into the car, Jen locks the doors, and she rips out of there. Jen was hysterical, crying and yelling, Did you see that? Over and over to Jessica. Jessica didn't see a thing, but she felt the same way Jen did when she heard a sound that she does not know how to explain. Jen says she saw something that shook her to her core. As she was looking around, she heard a branch snap and look over. About 9 feet off the ground, peeking around a tree, she saw a pale white face. I'll explain to you how she explained it to me the best I can. She said it was like looking into the husk of a humanoid, with no emotion, no life, nothing. The eyes were non-existent, and they only had a few strands of what looked like hair. She couldn't see if it had a mouth, but she said where the mouth was supposed to be, there was a red stain, which she believed to be blood. As she told me this story, she trembled and even cried. I've never ever seen her that way, and I trust her with my whole being. So I trust every word she says. I had to comfort and calm her down after she told me this. She still sees that face in her dreams sometimes. I hope she recovers from this experience, but it'll stick with you forever when you experience something so traumatic. I have a lot of stories to tell, and many of my friends have opened up to me about theirs. So maybe there will be more to come if you guys enjoyed this one. Urbex in the Woods by Jake. Before I begin this story, I want to say that this story is 100% true and occurred about 9 months ago. My friends and I used to love urban exploring in high school. We had gone to many places in or around our town and were somewhat experienced at this point. We decided to revisit this abandoned mental asylum on this cold, wintry night. This place was huge and very remote for apparent reasons. When I say it was huge, I mean it was the size of a small college campus in the middle of the woods. So my 4 friends and I arrived at this asylum around midnight. It was freezing this night, so we planned on staying inside as much as possible. Not that that would really help with all the busted windows. We started our journey across the campus to check out some of the buildings we missed the last time we had visited. For some background, most buildings were eradicated, windows smashed, and everything inside was trashed and graffitied. However, a few buildings still had windows, which meant they were probably staying more warm inside. So we explored 2 significant school-like buildings, and it was relatively uneventful. We cracked jokes, took pictures and videos, and had fun overall. This was when we decided to explore one of the smaller 2-story buildings. This building was completely overgrown but was mostly intact. All the windows were present, except for one with a sound-sized hole in the glass. The back and side door was locked, but we managed to force the front door open. As we were about to enter, we noticed one of those metal food trays that people usually put a salad in at parties next to the door. We honestly didn't really think much of it. We had seen a lot of weird things while exploring, and this was nowhere near the top of that list if I'm going to be real with you. We entered and started walking around, shining our flashlights everywhere, every which way. The inside of this building was trashed. Contrary to the outside, the first floor had a lot of dust in the air. So 3 of my friends decided to head out front and wait for my other friend, who I'll call Jason, for this story, and me. After finding nothing extraordinary in the basement or the first floor, we headed upstairs. As we turned to head up the stairs, we noticed the stairs were clogged with chairs and furniture, making it incredibly challenging to maneuver our way up. This should have been another red flag. But of course, we're too naive. Like, why would an area be blocked off if it wasn't for a good reason? We checked out a couple of office-type rooms and found some astounding paperwork and stuff that had been left behind. One room was gone when we reached to the end of the side of the hall. This door was closed, which was not unusual, so we tried the handle. It was locked. We tried option 2, which was to kick, but nothing. Last, we tried to body the door open, and it just wouldn't move. We said screw it and went to check on the other side of the second floor, but we heard the door creak open as we turned to walk. We turned and looked to confirm, but it was not open far enough to see anything more than the pitch black room inside. We pause for a second, and as we stand there confused, the door flings open. We see movement, obviously a person in dark clothing. We both turn and sprint to the stairs, jumping about 10 to 12 steps over the mountain of trash on the stairs. Our friends, in sight of the stairs at the front door, see us do this, slightly confused for a second, but quickly picked up on what was happening. We all ran the probable mile back to the car, absolutely freezing our asses off. Once we got to the car, we warmed up and explained what had happened to our friends. We determined it was probably a homeless person taking shelter in that building since it was somewhat warm compared to the 20 degrees outside. Nevertheless, still a scary experience because we have no idea what that person's intentions were when they flung that door open on us. We don't think they chased us, but they were not catching us, as we were all high school athletes and we were high on adrenaline. We have gone back since but have not gone near that particular building. I want to stress that when exploring urban areas, watch for signs of people living in places, as you never know how they might react. The Orchard by Undertaker, 1993. Hello everyone. I'm writing this for therapeutic reasons and as a warning to my fellow hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. My name is Aaron and I live in rural Virginia. Although this experience had made me question my love for hunting and the outdoors, I'm still a country boy at heart and I'll always love the outdoors and nature. I'm a hay and cattle farmer by trade, and I enjoy hunting and fishing whenever I get free time, which isn't very often, so it makes it all the more special to me. Around 3 years ago, one of my good friends that helped me on the farm put in a good word for me in our local hunting club, and I was voted in. I had been going hunting with him for a few years as a guest, but was excited to be able to pursue clubland whenever I wanted. Our hunting club has 2 properties that we lease from year to year. The first property is local and close to home. It's about 200 acres and is loaded with deer, bear, and other It's around 200 acres and is loaded with deer, bear, and other wildlife. The other is about a 45-minute drive over a mountain dubbed Sperryville Mountain by locals and is about 60 acres. The property is nicknamed The Orchard by our club because it was thriving with apple orchards up until the early 1970s. Unfortunately, now the property reminds you of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The beautiful and lush apple trees and scenic views are gone, replaced by dead trees and foliage. Nasty-looking vines with long, sharp thorns cover every haunting tree. The only beauty left in our little 60-acre plot is a beautiful freshwater stream that flows out to the national park that our land borders. Sadly, deer, bear, or any other wildlife is scarce, and sightings are even rarer primarily because the sun only shines on the property a few hours a day if it's lucky, causing a lack of food or vegetation to sustain wildlife. It's straightforward to hunt here for weeks without animal sightings outside the random bird or squirrel. You are probably wondering why anyone would waste their time hunting here. Well, the land is cheap, honestly. And for me, it's also simple. While our other members are hunting shoulder to shoulder on our other piece of property, I can drive over to the orchard and have nothing but peace surrounded by nature. Over the years, our fellow club members have tried to get us to give up on the property, saving club funds in search of a better piece of land, but another elderly gentleman named Rob and I have persuaded the others to renew our lease each year. Rob is a 70-year-old, heavy-set man with red cheeks and a snow-white beard. He always reminded me of a good old St. Nick. Rob is one of the original 3 founders of our club. The club was established in 1978, and the orchard was the first piece of land that club ever acquired in 1979. To him, the long-forgotten part of the lane is sentimental, and I have to agree. He welcomed me into the club and took me under his wing, so to speak, always nudging me to the side and giving me that comforting wink saying,
Boy, don't let the others discourage you. The place is next to the park. A monster can wander down at any time.
I have to say I agree because I have been fortunate enough to harvest a buck each of the last 3 years there. Nothing huge, but something tasty for my wife and I. Not to mention, it gives us plenty of food in the off-season. I hold the orchard close to my heart because of all the good memories I've had with Rob and a few other friends. But after this experience, I refuse to hunt there alone. It was a clear, excellent, crisp day in November with a slight breeze. I had just finished feeding the cattle for the final time that day, and I decided to load up my old 1989 Ford pickup with my ATV, backpack, and 6mm Remington hunting rifle and make the drive over the mountain. The drive over was uneventful, as I admired the hanging, changing autumn leaves and felt the crisp breeze go through my window. It was heaven in a sense. Finally, I pulled into the property full of hope of harvesting a nice buck and parked in a lot at the bottom of the road. I let the tailgate down and unload my four-wheeler, allowing it to warm up the few minutes before making up the 20-minute drive to the tree stand. Sticks and rocks crackled under the weight of my ATV as I slowly drove up the rough old mountain road, passing the run-down abandoned apple packing shed as I drove by. I had a good feeling in my gut that day, that this may be the day I land that trophy buck and finally shut up the other club members for good. Arriving at the stand, I shut the engine off and looked around, listening to the soft breeze stirring up leaves around me. Then taking off with my rifle on my shoulder and my backpack in hand, I began trying to tiptoe to the stand, trying my best to minimize the noise of my walking. But the dry autumn leaves that had made their trip to the ground had other plans. Making my slow ascent up the rusty rungs of the ladder on Rob's old tree stand, I sat down and couldn't help but think that the massive 12-point buck Rob had shot out of this very stand 20 years earlier would replay for me. His words always often reoccur in my mind, over and over like a broken record.
A monster could walk down any time.
As I would come to find out, this statement was more accurate than I could have ever imagined. Hours went by with nothing stirring but the occasional wind gust or noisy squirrel trying to stock up for winter. I was vigilant, checking for movement or noise in any direction to no avail. The cold autumn air nipping at my face and the sinking feeling in my stomach of another unsuccessful hunt was eating away at me. I checked my phone and saw the time was now 4:55 p.m., and in another 20 minutes or so, I said to myself I would have to leave. I always liked getting down to my truck before it got pitch black because I had a 20-minute ride back, and there was zero cell service in case of any sort of emergency. Directly to the west of the old tree stand was a steep cliffside covered in huge rocks and boulders. I scanned every rock for movement. Then, reaching down into my backpack, removing my lukewarm Mountain Dew, I took a sip before putting it back. I began looking back toward the rocks, and that's when I saw it. Horns. My heart started racing, and I began sweating through my winter clothes. This is it, I told myself. All this hard work is about to pay off finally. Raising my rifle and looking through the 3x9 scope, I saw the deer appeared to be an 11 or even 12-point buck. The animal made its way down slowly and carefully through the rocks until it was maybe 150 yards away. Although all I could see were antlers, I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for since I was a child. Then all my excitement began melting away like cheese in a microwave as the creature stood up. I saw a monster, but not the kind I wanted to see. I don't know what I was seeing, but I was looking at something 7 to 8 feet tall, a skeletal build with long arms and a strip of brown fur running through the length of its back. But the terrifying part was its head. It was a deer skull with no hide. Time stood still as I watched this thing through my scope. It began shuffling around and struggling with something like a soccer mom fumbling with bags of groceries as she tried to remove them from her overpacked minivan. I've always believed in Bigfoot, but this thing made Bigfoot look like a puppy. It was the most hideous thing I had ever laid my eyes on. I finally saw what it was fumbling with. In its right hand was a squirrel, limp and lifeless. The monster began squeezing the poor creature as its eyes were pushed out of its sockets from the pressure. Like some messed up butcher in a deli, the monster laid the squirrel on a rock and with its massive claws began carving the poor animal up. Blood and organs spilled out of the animal, and to my horror, the creature stuck out a long snake-like forked tongue and began devouring the squirrel. Lowering the gun, I was snapped back into my senses. Don't let this thing see you, is all I could think about. I internally prayed that this thing would turn and walk back into the park and be nothing but a memory. But it didn't. After finishing its meal, it looked around and stuck its tongue in and out like a cobra as it smelled around. I was quickly reminded of how dire my situation was as I noticed the darkness beginning to swallow up the forest around me. My finger quivered above the trigger as I fought this internal urge to fire at this monster. But a voice deep inside my gut told me it wouldn't do any good. I lowered the rifle slowly from my eye and looked to my four-wheeler, then back to the creature, and decided I would make a mad dash. With trembling hands, I stood up slowly, grabbing the railing of the stand, and began making my way down the ladder. Occasionally looking behind me to make sure the creature wasn't looking my way, and thank God it wasn't. My confidence was quickly cut off as I stepped off the last rung of the stand and my size 12 boots crushed some of the bone-dry autumn leaves. It might as well have been a dump truck driving through a nitroglycerin plant. Whirling around, I realized the creature was looking right at me. We stared at each other from across the wooden distance, and even though it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, it was like I was sweating through my heavy winter clothes. I thought about my wife, my farm, my dog, and my life, and decided I wasn't dying today if I could help it. Before I knew it, I was running toward my ATV, thorns cut at my face and ripped at my clothes as I ran. My gun was bouncing uncomfortably against my back as I felt blood trickle down my face from the cuts and prayed I wouldn't trip over anything in my sprint. Arriving at my ATV, I groped through my pockets for the keys, pulling the key from my pocket. I struggled to find the ignition switch, hands shaking like a heavy smoker who hadn't had a light in a week. My spirit lifted as the engine roared to life, but reality kicked in as I turned around and to my horror, all I saw was a massive polar white deer and bright yellow eyes reflecting off my ATV's taillights, teeth bared and tongue flicking in and out like a snake. It let out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I gunned the ATV and began tearing down that mountain. Rocks and dips in the road threatened to overturn the four-wheeler, but I knew I couldn't afford to slow my pace. I could hear heavy footsteps and sticks and limbs breaking behind me the entire time. The creature was no more than 50 yards behind me. Gunning the mountain faster and faster, I finally reached the old packing shed I mentioned earlier, which signified I was almost to the bottom. Looking around, I realized the creature was nowhere in sight. There was nothing. My breathing slowed and I stopped to listen. Nothing was stirring but the dying leaves in the treetops holding on to dear life swaying in the wind against the moonlight. I looked at the packing shed and my heart sank to my boots. Peeking out from the side of the building was a deer skull and a long skeletal hand. Holy hell! I yelled as I took off again. I turned around as the creature came fully into my view, from behind the old broken-down building. and I still don't understand why I did this. I slammed on the brakes, turned my rifle, and fired, hitting the creature square in the upper torso. The creature staggered slightly as dark fluid trickled down from its wound, but to my horror, all it did was touch the gaping hole with its massive clawed hand. And I swear it smiled at me. To hell with this, I thought as I hit the gas and barreled down the mountain one more time. My truck's taillights came into view, and I knew salvation was near. Thank God I left my ramps down. I hit the ramps like a BMX rider in the X Games, and my four-wheeler stopped in my truck bed with a hard thud, throwing my ramps into the bed and slamming the tailgate of my truck shut. I fumbled for my truck keys and found them very quickly. Throwing my rifle into the passenger seat, I cranked the old beast of a truck over. My heart threatened to beat out of my chest until the car finally started. Looking back through the mirror, I almost cried as I saw this thing walking through the diesel smoke my truck emitted like a phantom in a graveyard. My backpack, in its left hand, cocked its head to the side as it approached my vehicle, and I swear to God, once again, it smiled. It freaking smiled. Dirty, rotten brown teeth showed in my lights as they stalked closer and closer. I absolutely floored the old pickup and didn't slow until I hit the main road. Tears streamed down my face as I drove the long trip home. I haven't bothered telling anyone of this story because who's going to believe me? I thought sharing this was my only hope of getting this out there. Believe it or not, I went back down a few times that season, but only in groups of 3. I felt awful for not telling my fellow companions about what I saw due to their safety, but I knew they would laugh me off. The day after this happened, I contemplated whether or not this actually did go down. Could I have just imagined this, had some sort of mental breakdown? I got my answers that night as I checked my wireless game camera from the comfort of my living room. That night, after I left at 10:30 p.m., the creature came into view on my trail camera, and it hung my backpack on the bottom rung of the ladder. It turned towards the camera, and I swear once again it smiled that god-awful smile again before smashing it. I now know why animal sightings in the orchard are so very rare. And I don't know what I will say when I'm asked when we should renew the lease this year. I can't get this experience out of my head. I want to go back, but I know that monster is still there somewhere. All I know is when I lay down in my bed at night, all I hear in my head are Rob's words.
A monster could walk out of there any time.
Lost in the Woods by Bad Guys Fan 1422. So this isn't my personal story. It's from my lifelong friend Jackson, whom I've been friends with for 17 years. And in all that time, the only incident that has ever scared me or him was this. Years ago, we were on a camping trip with his family. It was the summer of 2008 at the time, and we were relaxing on the way to the campsite. We got to this small town and decided to camp in those woods. So we set up camp, Jackson's mom made dinner, and after all that, we watched other camping videos their family recorded. We made marshmallows and had a fun time. Then at around 8:30 we went to bed. And now we're going to shift into Jackson's perspective. Sometime at around 1 a.m. he woke up. He says he didn't know why, and since he woke up, he walked around and used the bathroom. It was sometime around 5 minutes later when he heard something he had not noticed before. It was a faint noise, like a thumping noise. Jackson, being the cocky person he is, muttered, "People don't know how to be quiet out here." He assumed it was somebody drunk or something taking long, exaggerated steps, but it stayed the same volume every time. Then he got curious and walked toward the noise. He hid behind a bush when he got close enough. What he saw scared him so bad he forgot to even scream, which probably saved his life. A man had dismembered body parts with him and was trying to stick them to a tree. He had multiple dismemberments with him. Then he saw a bag full of axes and saws. That's what he was hearing. The thump was him using an axe to stick a body to a tree, dragging another to a different tree, then attaching that one. Thump, thump, drag, drag. Now it all made sense, but Jackson was so confused. Then the man looked directly at him. Jackson ran the second he noticed and got lost somewhere in the woods. He somehow lost the man, but he realized he was now lost entirely, having no idea where to go in the dark. Switching back to my perspective, I woke up hours later and saw he was gone. So I woke up his parents and we called out for him. We did eventually find him, but his clothes were torn, his eyes were baggy, and he was in shock. We took him to the hospital, and he was having nightmares for some time. Every night he'd wake up screaming, "Don't kill me, please." When he finally calmed out of his mental state, he told everyone the story, and I believe him entirely because why would he lie about this? 14 years later and we're still good friends. This incident has never been forgotten, only ignored by us, but I wanted to tell you this to get it off my chest. The Woman in the Park by Anonymous. So this is a real story. It is something that did happen to me. I was in a park with my mother waiting for my dad to come. I was sitting on a bench and then I saw an old woman. She was looking straight at me, straight into my eyes. I swear in her look was something downright evil. I thought maybe I was hallucinating or just making things up. At the time, she was sitting next to a tree in the upper right corner of the park. From the right corner of the park to the upper left corner were like 10 meters. I blinked and she was in the left corner all of a sudden, and she was still looking straight at me, straight into my eyes with this look of malice. I thought maybe it was just my imagination again. I didn't tell anyone about it until I had a couple of nightmares in that same place, with the same old woman. The priest of the village and I were excellent friends, and when we met at the church, he saw that I wasn't all right. He asked me what had happened and what was going on. I asked him not to laugh at me and told him everything, detail by detail, not missing anything. What he told me shocked me. He said the old woman was an evil spirit, like a demon or something. I didn't believe him at first. Then I went to the people that were with me at the park at the time that day and told them about it, and they also agreed that it did sound like it was something evil. So, being religious, I got myself cleansed, and I haven't seen her ever since, but I don't really go to that park too much just because I am kind of paranoid. The Garden Intruder by Sonora. A few summers ago, I ended up working in a small garden outside my work since our workload slowed down in the summer. I worked at a factory surrounded by olive trees and other trees like apricot, peach, cherry, pear, and apple. Beyond the tree line, on one of the short ends of the small rectangular garden, there were a bunch of tall, thick weeds and shrubbery directly after the front of the tree line. On the garden fence itself at the end, thick, tangled grapevines had overgrown the wall of the garden and the chain-link perimeter fence of the property in that area. It was a scorching day, as it was July. The hummingbirds buzzed near the feeders and the other birds sang their summer songs. I greeted our factory dog, Buddy, lazing outside the garden in the shade of an olive tree. He gazed at me with his neon-like blue eyes and wagged his black and white fluffy tail before dozing off again. I continued to chat with my buddy as I worked, just off in my safe little world. As I worked, I vaguely noticed the sounds of bushes and shrubbery rustling slightly, which I blew off as a breeze. But after a few minutes more, I realized that the rustling sounds were pretty constant, and after briefly glancing around many of the trees, I noticed that there didn't appear to be a breeze on that hot July day. So at that point, it was probably Buddy sniffing around the bushes. But that thought went out the window when I turned back towards the garden entrance for a shovel, and there was Buddy, still lazing in the same exact place I had left him. Now, if you know dogs, you know that Buddy should have been losing his crap right about then. Yet he was resting there with no care in the world. I decided to give it a couple of more minutes to make sure. It could have been my husband, who also worked at the factory with me, or my boss or another coworker, for all I knew. But as I casually paid attention to what I was hearing, I could tell that the movements were slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was in the grapevines and bushes was moving precisely. My heart began to race as I imagined a bear or a mountain lion stalking me. So I snuck out of the garden entrance and stepped over a couple of feet to investigate. Seeing through the thick shrubbery beyond the olive and cherry trees was difficult. I had to focus, like when you try to see one of those hidden 3D images. Once I did, though, I started to see movement beyond the grapevines, bushes, and weeds. After a few seconds, I began to make out the shape of human legs. Whoever was there wore a pair of medium faded blue jeans and looked like some sort of black hiking or work boots. All I could think of at the time was, holy crap, it's a person. They were moving away from me towards the railroad tracks beyond the chain link perimeter fence. All I could think to do at that point was walk around the perimeter of the fence and up to the railroad tracks to see if I could get a better vantage point and see the person. I knew the person would be trapped by the perimeter fence hidden by the grapevines. Once I got up there, I saw a man crouched next to the chain link fence, staring right at me. It was strange to me because he wore the medium colored blue jeans and heavy black boots I mentioned earlier. Still, he also sported a black beanie, a dark hooded sweatshirt, and a backpack, all despite it being 100+ degrees outside that day. As he stared at me with those dark, beady, close-set eyes, I asked him, "Who are you, and why are you here?" But he just stared at me, unblinking with a pale face, and didn't say a word to me. He just sat there, frozen and unmoving. Looking back, I don't think he blinked or moved at all. So I gave up after a few seconds and went into the factory to tell someone. I found my husband first, but he pretty much just dismissed it. So I went to my boss next. We both went back to the garden to investigate, but no one was there anymore. Just Buddy, casually wandering into the bushes towards the tracks. Being a dog, Buddy should have been more alarmed, yet he wasn't, which was weird to my boss. Just then, though, my coworker arrived with his dog, who was promptly sent to investigate the area. Meanwhile, the other coworker went inside the factory to get the forklift, which he drove outside to us. Then, we had my husband lift the forklift as high as we could so my coworker could stand at a vantage point and get a good look for the guy, or maybe a car leaving or something. But I don't think he ever actually saw anything. Once we got back into the factory and inside the boss's air-conditioned office, the boss had something interesting to tell us about the night before. First off, he informed us that we all had no running water in the whole industrial park. However, the exciting part came when he explained why there was no water. The night before, a couple of guys tried stealing a big rig or something from one of the businesses located up past us in the park. When they tried to escape the truck after nearly getting caught, they tried to jump across a small creek where the water main coming into the industrial park happened to be. They of course didn't make it and ended up smashing the water main to all the businesses in the park. I would have to determine if the intruder amongst the grapevines was related to that incident. We called the sheriff just in case, and they came out and took a report and got a description of the intruder from me. But of course, none of the outside security cameras caught it since it was behind the tree line and amongst the heavy shrubbery. But I guess we'll never know.